A millionaire believed his secret love affair was perfectly hidden, whisking his mistress away to a luxurious mansion. But as he poured champagne and whispered sweet lies, the front door creaked open. His pregnant wife stood there, calm, composed, and holding something that would dismantle everything he thought he controlled. The soft hum of classical music floated through the high ceilings of the secluded mansion nestled deep within the mountains. The scent of cedarwood from the fireplace mingled with the distant aroma of red wine, filling the air with an elegant warmth that wrapped around the rooms like a velvet cloak. Outside, snow had begun to fall lightly, dressing the treetops in white, creating a postcard-perfect scene of isolation. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but innocent. Lucas Hartwell stood near the massive glass doors, a glass of Bordeaux in his hand, swirling it absent-mindedly as his eyes scanned the landscape. 42 years old, impeccably groomed, dressed in a tailored navy sweater and charcoal pants, he looked every bit the successful man he had spent 2 decades building himself into. His dark hair, touched with strands of silver at the temples, gave him a mature appeal that only money and power could truly elevate. His posture was relaxed, confident, the kind of stance only a man who believed he controlled the world around him could maintain. Behind him, a soft laugh rang out, melodic, flirtatious, young. It came from Jasmine, the woman curled lazily across the leather chaise lounge, her legs tucked beneath her, her silk robe loosely tied around her waist. She was 26, olive-skinned, with long black hair cascading over her bare shoulders and eyes that danced with mischief every time they met his. She held her wine with practiced elegance, but everything about her spoke of calculated charm. The way she crossed her legs, the subtle arch of her back, the way her eyes lingered on Lucas just a second too long. "This place is unreal," she said, running her fingers along the edge of the crystal wine glass. "I mean, I've seen luxury, but this? It's like a secret world." Lucas turned slightly, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's the point," he replied. "No one knows about this place. Not even my business partners. It's private." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, amused. "Not even your wife?" He chuckled, sipping the wine. "Especially not her." The name, or rather, the reminder, of Celeste brought a flicker of tension to his jaw. Celeste, his wife of 12 years, now 8 months pregnant with their first child, was back in the city, most likely nestled in their penthouse suite, poring over baby catalogs and listening to lullabies. She had insisted on preparing every detail herself: the nursery paint color, the crib style, the baby shower guest list. She had become so consumed by motherhood that she had all but forgotten the man who had built the world around her. Or so Lucas told himself. He wandered over to the chaise and sat beside Jasmine, draping an arm across the back of the sofa, letting his fingers play with the edge of her robe. She leaned into him, her perfume light but intoxicating. Everything about her was a deliberate escape from the structure and demands of his real life. Jasmine didn't ask for spreadsheets or business strategies or emotional support. She just existed, vibrant, flirtatious, and constantly impressed by everything Lucas offered. "This is what I imagine freedom feels like," she said, stretching like a cat under his arm. "No expectations, no responsibilities, just you, me, and this ridiculous view." Lucas laughed softly, but something in her words unsettled him. Freedom. That was exactly what he thought he wanted, wasn't it? He had worked his whole life to reach this level. Money, reputation, influence. But lately, there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, where it all felt hollow. He dismissed the thought quickly. This wasn't the time for reflection. This was supposed to be his weekend of indulgence. The day passed with slow decadence. A private chef prepared their meals, delivering course after course of exquisite dishes. Jasmine paraded through the house in silk and lace, teasing, whispering, always within reach, but never too close. Lucas drank, laughed, played along, convincing himself that he was still in control of it all. The game, the relationship, the consequences. By evening, snow had thickened outside, coating the world in silence. The fireplace crackled, throwing dancing shadows across the room, and Lucas leaned back with a drink, watching Jasmine scroll through her phone. She'd been oddly quiet for the past few minutes, her fingers tapping rapidly as she typed a message, then paused, then typed again. "Something wrong?" he asked. Jasmine looked up quickly, forcing a smile. Just checking messages. My friend's being dramatic again. Lucas nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered on her a moment longer. There was something off in her expression, a flicker of unease, a hint of hesitation. He considered asking more, but chose not to. He had learned long ago that silence sometimes maintained power better than confrontation. A moment later, Jasmine set the phone down and stood, walking to the grand piano in the corner of the room. She pressed a few keys, letting the soft notes drift into the air, her back to him as she swayed gently. "I wonder what your wife's doing right now," she said casually, almost as if she didn't mean it to sting. Lucas's lips tightened. He rose, walking to her, placing his hands on her hips from behind. "Probably choosing crib sheets or practicing breathing exercises," he muttered. Jasmine turned her head, just slightly. "She doesn't suspect anything?" "She suspects everything," he said, half laughing. "But suspicion and proof are two very different things." She turned fully to face him then, studying his eyes for a beat longer than usual. "And what happens when suspicion turns into proof?" Lucas stared at her. "That's a problem for later." And yet, even as he said the words, the nagging feeling returned. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or paranoia, but something unsettled him now. Something he couldn't quite place. The doorbell rang. The sound sliced through the moment like a blade, sharp and unexpected. Both of them froze. "Did you hear that?" Jasmine whispered. Lucas nodded, already moving toward the hallway. Nobody's supposed to be here. His pulse quickened. He checked the security screen, but saw nothing at first. Then, a figure stepped into view, a woman in a long coat, standing just beyond the porch light. The screen was grainy, but her silhouette was unmistakable. Celeste. His throat tightened. Time seemed to slow as his mind scrambled for logic, for explanation. How had she found him? Who had told her? Why was she here, alone? Or was she? The doorbell rang again. Jasmine appeared behind him, peering over his shoulder. "Is that her?" Lucas didn't answer. He walked toward the door, heart pounding now, the illusion of control unraveling with each step. He opened it slowly, and there she was, Celeste, poised, 8 months pregnant, and utterly unreadable. Her eyes met his, calm and steady, not a hint of panic or rage. And beside her stood a man, tall, sharp, commanding, a stranger. His hand hovered near the small of her back, a gesture too familiar to ignore. "Lucas," she said evenly, "we need to talk." Lucas's mouth went dry. The air between them pulsed with tension. Jasmine stepped back, instinctively adjusting her robe. The stranger extended a hand. Cole Whitman, Elisa's business associate. Associate? Lucas couldn't speak. Everything around him felt suddenly unstable, unreal. And yet, the most haunting thing in that moment wasn't Celeste's sudden arrival or the presence of another man. It was the fact that she was smiling. And that smile didn't belong to a woman who came to confront her husband. It belonged to a woman who came to deliver something far worse. Before we dive deeper into what happens next, pause for a second. If you were in her place, what would you do? Drop your thoughts in the comments and rate the story from 0 to 10 so far. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe. This story's only just beginning. Jasmine stood still by the grand window, her fingers resting lightly on the silk curtains, eyes fixed on the snow-covered path where just minutes ago, Celeste had stood with that composed elegance that haunted her now. The image refused to leave her mind. The way the pregnant wife had looked at Lucas, not with pain or desperation, but with a kind of quiet strength that unsettled everything Jasmine thought she knew. It wasn't jealousy that gripped her chest now, it was uncertainty. And that was a feeling she was entirely unfamiliar with. She had always been the one in control, the one who played her cards just right. She knew how to read a man's attention, how to pull his desire to the surface and keep it burning. Lucas had been no exception. From the first time they met at one of his business events, she saw the signs, the lingering glances, the subtle compliments, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. She hadn't needed to chase him. He came to her willingly, like they all did. But unlike the others, he brought her here, to this mansion, to this fantasy. And Jasmine believed, even if she never said it out loud, that she was more than a fleeting escape. She believed she was replacing Celeste. She walked across the living room, her robe clinging to her legs as her thoughts spun faster than she could contain. Her heels echoed on the marble floor as she crossed the room again, each step sharper than the last. Something about tonight had shifted the ground beneath her. Everything Lucas had promised, the whispered future plans, the hidden property, the intimate moments, suddenly felt fragile. If Celeste had known about this place all along, what else had she known? If she had shown up here, what had she come for? And who was that man by her side? Jasmine sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, her posture stiff, her eyes blank as she replayed every conversation she'd had with Lucas over the past few months. He had always painted his wife as dull, as someone clinging to a marriage that was already over in his heart. He made it sound like she was a placeholder, an obligation. Jasmine never questioned it. Why would she? He bought her gifts without hesitation. He kissed her in places he said were never meant for his wife. He whispered that she made him feel alive again. She drank in his attention like fine wine, heady, intoxicating, convincing. But Celeste's presence tonight shattered that illusion. Her poise, her calm demeanor, and that subtle smile that barely touched her lips. It wasn't the face of a woman who was breaking. It was the face of a woman who had already won. And that terrified Jasmine more than any confrontation could have. She thought she'd be fighting a desperate, broken wife, someone she could dismiss and mock behind closed doors. But what she saw was entirely different. It was strategy. It was silence filled with meaning. It was a warning, delivered without a single threat spoken aloud. Lucas entered the room moments later, his expression tense, his shoulders slightly hunched. He moved slower now, less sure of himself. That didn't go unnoticed by Jasmine. She watched him carefully, her arms crossed, waiting for him to speak. But he didn't, not immediately. He poured himself another drink, downing half of it in a single gulp before finally looking at her. "She shouldn't have come here," he said, voice low, almost bitter. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. And yet she did, with another man. Lucas frowned, placing the glass on the edge of the fireplace mantel. "He's just a business contact." Jasmine tilted her head slightly. He didn't look like a business contact. He looked like someone she trusts. Someone who's been by her side for more than just deals and paperwork. Lucas turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have time to explain every detail. But I think I deserve to know something, don't you?" Jasmine snapped, her voice sharper than before. "You brought me here, Lucas. You made me believe this place, this entire weekend, was ours. Now your pregnant wife shows up like she owns the place, and you're acting like it's just a minor inconvenience." He turned to her then, eyes dark with frustration. Because it wasn't supposed to happen this way. She wasn't supposed to know. "That's not an answer," Jasmine replied coldly. "That's an excuse." Silence stretched between them. Jasmine stood and walked toward him, her voice calmer now, but still firm. "Tell me something, Lucas. Did you ever plan to leave her? Or was I just a distraction you used when the real world became too heavy?" His jaw clenched, but he didn't respond immediately. She stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint trace of his cologne, close enough to see the flicker of conflict in his eyes. "I need to know," she said softly, almost pleading. "Because if she's just a shadow from your past, why does she have the power to make you look like a man who's just been stripped of everything?" Lucas stared at her, and for a brief moment, the walls around him cracked. "It's complicated," he murmured. Jasmine scoffed. "No, it's not. It's only complicated when you lie to two people at the same time." He walked past her, back to the bar, refilling his glass with trembling hands. "I care about you," he said without turning around. "You know that." "But not enough to choose," Jasmine replied. "Not enough to make her leave." Lucas exhaled slowly. "I didn't bring you here to hurt you. I brought you because I thought I could have something separate, something untouched." Jasmine's heart twisted at those words. Something separate, something untouched. As if she were a secret to be stored away, a convenience tucked between meetings and family dinners. She had believed in something more, a future, a promise. But now she wasn't sure if any of it had ever been real. "Do you think she'll come back?" Jasmine asked quietly. Lucas hesitated. "I don't know. Because if she does," Jasmine continued, "I think I already know who you'll choose." And in that moment, it was no longer about jealousy or territory. It was about truth. The unspoken truth that lingered in the corners of the mansion, in the heavy silences between sentences, in the way Lucas's voice faltered every time he spoke of his wife. Jasmine turned away from him, walking slowly toward the hallway, each step echoing louder than the last. She knew her place now. Not the future queen. Not the new beginning. just the chapter he never intended to finish. But somewhere in her chest, pride still burned. And she would not let herself be discarded without leaving a mark, even if she had to become the storm that tore everything down. The city lights twinkled beneath a blanket of dusk as Celeste Langston stood silently by the window of her penthouse, her hands gently resting on the curve of her swollen belly. 8 months along, and every movement within her felt like a gentle reminder that time was slipping forward, that life was changing, even if everything around her seemed to be standing still. She had spent most of the day in silence, moving from room to room, touching the objects that once made this place feel like a home. A framed photo from their honeymoon, a crystal vase gifted by his parents, a designer armchair Lucas insisted on importing from Italy. Each item told a story, and each story, she now realized, had become irrelevant. The man she had built a life with, the man who once looked at her like she was the center of his universe, was no longer hers, not in spirit, not in presence, and perhaps not even in name. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was another message from her mother, asking how she was feeling, reminding her to rest, suggesting names for the baby. Celeste read the text, but didn't reply. She appreciated the concern, but there were things no one could help her with. Not her mother, not her friends, not even the therapist she had secretly begun seeing when the marriage started to feel more like a contract than a connection. There was a growing weight inside her that had nothing to do with the child she carried. It was the weight of betrayal, of humiliation, of knowing that while she sat here alone, folding tiny baby clothes and planning a nursery theme, her husband was out in some hidden corner of the world, whispering affection to another woman. And yet, she didn't cry. She hadn't cried in weeks. The tears had dried up long ago, replaced by a cold clarity that only comes when something inside a person breaks. Not loudly, but quietly, like the silent fracture of a porcelain vase dropped on a soft carpet. She walked into the bedroom, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared at the half-empty closet. She had stopped asking questions the day she realized Lucas wasn't even trying to lie anymore. His excuses were lazy, his absences growing longer, his apologies mechanical. There had been lipstick stains once, faint, but unmistakable. Perfume that didn't belong to her. A hotel charge on the credit card for a place they had never stayed together. And yet, she said nothing. She simply observed, like a scientist studying a dying star. Not because she didn't care, but because she needed to understand how far he would go. And now she knew. She reached for her journal from the nightstand, a leather-bound book she had begun keeping months ago when her intuition first started whispering. She flipped through the pages, reading old entries written in a steadier hand than she had today. Notes about missed dinners, cold touches, empty conversations. Details that seemed insignificant in isolation, but formed a devastating pattern when laid out side by side. On one page, she had even drawn a timeline, marking the frequency of his overnight trips, cross-referencing them with the dates of unspoken tension between them. It wasn't just suspicion. It was evidence. It was reality. As she closed the journal, her eyes drifted toward the photo on the dresser. It was from a gala 2 years ago, Lucas in his tuxedo, her in a satin emerald gown, both of them smiling for the cameras, the epitome of a power couple. But even then, the cracks had begun to show. She remembered the argument they had in the car afterward, something about a business associate she had smiled at for too long. He accused her of disrespect. She had laughed, confused by his sudden jealousy. But now she understood. It wasn't about her. It was about control, about possession. Lucas wasn't threatened by the man. He was threatened by the idea that Celeste might still command attention. And now that she no longer did, not in his eyes, at least, he no longer needed to pretend. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Celeste turned toward the door just as her assistant, Maya, entered the room holding a folder. "The documents you requested," she said softly, placing the folder on the nightstand. Celeste nodded, her voice calm. "Thank you, Maya. Did you manage to get a hold of him?" Maya hesitated. "He's not answering, but his secretary said he's out of town on business." Business. The word felt almost comedic now. Celeste smiled faintly and opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, asset evaluations, and legal papers. She had already spoken to her lawyer discreetly. She wasn't filing anything yet, but she needed to be prepared. If Lucas wanted to play in the shadows, She would make sure he knew how it felt when light was finally cast upon them. Maya lingered for a moment, unsure if she should leave. Is there anything else I can do? Celeste looked at her assistant, sensing the worry behind her professional expression. Yes, she said. Call Cole Bennett. Tell him I'll meet him for lunch tomorrow. Maya's eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise, but she nodded and left without a word. Celeste stood again and walked back to the window, her hands now resting protectively over her stomach. Cole. He had been a colleague once, then a friend, and more recently, a confidant. He had always respected her, not because she was Lucas's wife, but because she was Celeste. Strong, insightful, capable. Their conversations had grown deeper lately, not flirtatious, but layered with a kind of understanding that only those who have been quietly betrayed can recognize in one another. As the night wore on, Celeste remained awake, her mind working like clockwork. She wasn't plotting revenge, not in the dramatic sense. She wasn't interested in shouting matches or courtroom battles. She was preparing to reposition herself, to take control of what he thought was his alone. The company, the investments, the legacy they built together, none of it would slip through her fingers. She would not be the humiliated wife left behind in the shadows. She would not allow her child to grow up watching her mother shrink under the weight of someone else's power. When dawn broke, painting the sky in faint shades of orange and lavender, Celeste was already dressed. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her coat, brushing her hair, slipping into heels that she hadn't worn in weeks. Pregnancy had made her body change, but it hadn't changed her mind. It had only sharpened it. As she stepped out of the apartment, the crisp morning air hit her face like a whisper of awakening. She walked with purpose, her steps steady, her silence louder than any scream. The city moved around her, cars rushing by, pedestrians glued to their phones, the usual noise of daily chaos. But within her, there was only stillness. A focused, burning stillness. As the car pulled up and she slid into the back seat, she gave the driver the address of the restaurant where she was to meet Cole. It wasn't just a casual lunch. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where Lucas would no longer dictate the narrative. One where Celeste Langston would rise not as a wife scorned, but as a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. And as the vehicle sped through the streets, she didn't look back. There was nothing behind her worth holding on to anymore. What mattered was ahead. And this time, she would not wait to be invited into the room. She would own it. The restaurant was nestled on a quiet street corner, its minimalist exterior giving no indication of the exclusivity that pulsed behind its frosted glass doors. Inside, the lighting was warm, the scent of roasted spices drifted softly through the air, and every table was arranged with just enough space to ensure discretion. It was a place where high-stakes conversations were held in low tones, where deals were sealed between courses, and where power wore the face of civility. Celeste arrived precisely on time, stepping out of the car with effortless poise, her coat draped elegantly over her shoulders, her hair pulled into a neat chignon. She moved with a confidence that wasn't loud but impossible to ignore, a quiet certainty that had begun to take root inside her the moment she stopped waiting for Lucas to come home. The hostess recognized her immediately and guided her to a corner table already prepared with a reserved sign and a bottle of still water chilling beside two glasses. Celeste sat down slowly, her hand resting gently over her belly, her eyes scanning the room not out of suspicion but out of habit. She had learned to observe the world like Lucas did, calculated, careful, always one step ahead. But unlike him, she did it without arrogance. She didn't need people to know she was the smartest person in the room. She only needed to act like it. Cole Bennett arrived a few minutes later. Tall, composed, and dressed in a crisp charcoal suit, he had the kind of presence that didn't demand attention but naturally commanded it. As he approached the table, his smile was genuine, but his eyes were searching, already reading her mood before she said a word. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without formalities. "You look radiant," he said softly, his voice a low baritone that carried an undertone of curiosity. "But something tells me this isn't just a social lunch." Celeste let out a faint breath, part smile, part sigh. "You're right," she replied. "I need to talk business." He nodded slowly, folding his hands on the table. "I thought so. I'm listening." For a moment, she didn't speak. She simply reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek black folder, placing it gently on the table between them. Cole looked at it, then back at her, but didn't reach for it yet. He waited, letting her set the pace. Celeste appreciated that about him. His ability to listen, to observe without interrupting, to understand the weight of silence. "I've been working on something," she began, her voice measured. Something Lucas never saw coming. Cole's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I'm intrigued already." Celeste opened the folder, revealing a set of neatly organized documents. Investment strategies, market analyses, proposals for strategic partnerships, all mapped out in a level of detail that even seasoned professionals would find impressive. Cole began to scan the pages, his eyes narrowing with interest. "You did all this?" he asked after a moment. She nodded. "I've been building it for months." Quietly, observing the gaps in Lucas's portfolio, the risks he's ignored, the opportunities he dismissed because he was too focused on expansion and not sustainability. He's chasing short-term dominance. "I want long-term resilience." Cole leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. "This is comprehensive. You're not just building an alternative. You're building a better version of everything he thought was untouchable." Celeste looked down briefly, her hand drifting again to her stomach. "I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't want to have to prepare for war. But he forced my hand." Cole's gaze softened. "You've always had the mind for this. He just never saw it." Celeste met his eyes, and there was something in her expression that flickered for a moment. Regret, perhaps, or the remnants of what had once been love. "He saw it," she said quietly. "He just didn't want to share the space." There was a pause, and then Cole reached for his glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it down again. "So what's your next move?" "I want to launch before he does," she replied without hesitation. "While he's distracted, while he's underestimating me, while he's still busy convincing his investors that his mistress is a better business partner than his own wife." Cole chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "He's made a mistake he won't recover from." Celeste didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them like smoke. Lucas had underestimated the wrong woman. He had invested in appearances while ignoring substance. And now the consequences were quietly unraveling everything he had built. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, timelines, potential alliances. Cole offered his own resources, contacts in private equity, access to legal advisors, introductions to silent investors who had grown disenchanted with Lucas's increasingly erratic leadership style. Every detail was handled with precision. Every step was calculated not to hurt Lucas, but to leave him irrelevant. Celeste wasn't seeking revenge in a traditional sense. She wasn't trying to destroy him. She was trying to outgrow him. As they prepared to leave, Cole touched her arm lightly, just enough to pause her. "You know you're not alone in this, right?" She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes calm. "I know, but I need to do it like I was alone. Because that's how he left me." Back at the penthouse, the silence welcomed her like an old friend. She walked through the room slowly, observing everything with new eyes. The marble countertops, the leather armchairs, the art Lucas insisted on displaying. All symbols of a life that once dazzled her, but now felt cold, impersonal. She stood in the living room, her eyes drifting to a photo of the two of them on the bookshelf. She picked it up, studying their smiles, the way his arm curled around her shoulder. It had been taken in better times, or at least in times when she still believed things could get better. Without hesitation, she placed the photo face down. Later that evening, she sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the snow fall gently across the city skyline. The baby moved inside her, a slow, steady flutter. She placed a hand over her stomach, whispering words only the unborn child could hear. "You'll never have to wonder what strength looks like," she said softly, "because you'll grow up watching it." Her phone buzzed again, a message from her lawyer confirming the transfer of key documents. Everything was in motion now. Every step was mapped out. She wasn't acting on emotion anymore. She was executing a plan. Across the city, Lucas stood in the great room of the mansion, staring into the fireplace as if it could offer answers. Jasmine had gone quiet again, retreating to one of the guest rooms after their earlier conversation had soured. The tension between them had thickened, no longer masked by flirtation or distraction. Something was off, and he could feel it, but he couldn't identify it. He still believed he was in control. He still believed Celeste's visit was a fleeting anomaly. He hadn't yet realized that she wasn't knocking on doors anymore. She was building her own. and when he finally turned to look behind him, he would discover there was no one left to follow him. The morning sun filtered through the towering glass windows of the mountain mansion, casting long beams of light across the polished marble floor. The snow outside glistened under the pale orange hue of dawn, but inside the house, the atmosphere was starkly different. Tension had begun to seep through the walls like smoke, invisible yet suffocating. Lucas stood in the kitchen, staring at the espresso machine as it hissed softly, his mind miles away. The scent of roasted coffee beans filled the air, but it did nothing to calm the restlessness growing in his chest. The events of the previous night played in loops in his mind. Celeste's unexpected arrival, her composure, the man who accompanied her, the unspoken message behind their presence. Something about the entire encounter gnawed at him, an itch beneath his skin he couldn't scratch. He had expected tears, accusations, maybe even begging. Instead, she left him with silence, and that was far worse. He didn't know what she was planning, and for the first time in years, he realized he had no idea what was going on inside her mind. Jasmine entered the room moments later, barefoot, her robe cinched tighter than usual, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and suspicion. She didn't speak at first, simply poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the island counter. Her eyes watched Lucas carefully, analyzing his every movement. He barely looked at her, absorbed in his thoughts, which only irritated her more. She had spent months working her way into his life, playing the perfect companion, entertaining his whims, molding herself into what he wanted her to be. But now she was starting to realize she had walked into a situation far more complex than she anticipated. She thought she was winning. Now she wasn't so sure. "Did you even sleep last night?" she asked, breaking the silence. Lucas didn't answer immediately. He took a slow sip of his espresso before replying, "A few hours." Jasmine crossed her arms. "You've been distant since she showed up." "She surprised me. That's all," he muttered. "That's not all," she snapped. "You haven't said a word about what she wanted. What did she come here for, Lucas? What did she say?" Lucas set his cup down a little too forcefully. "She didn't say much." "Exactly," Jasmine replied coldly. "And that's what worries me." Lucas looked at her now, eyes sharp. "What do you mean?" "I mean no woman shows up unannounced like that, heavily pregnant, with another man by her side, just to say hello," she said, her voice low but firm. "She's not stupid. She's planning something." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I know she's planning something. I just don't know what. And that doesn't bother you?" "Of course it does," he snapped. "But I can't fight a ghost. I can't react to something I can't see." Jasmine shook her head slowly. "Maybe you've underestimated her." Lucas's jaw clenched. He didn't like hearing that, even if it was true. He had spent years building his image, his empire, his life with precision. He made mistakes, yes, but he always believed he was 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Yet Celeste's arrival had shattered that illusion. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't wept, she hadn't begged for explanations. She simply appeared, left her silence behind, and vanished, taking all his assumptions with her. Later that day, Lucas received a call from one of his business advisors. The tone on the other end of the line was polite but cautious, the kind of measured concern that masked deeper issues. "There's been some movement in one of your accounts," the advisor said. "It's probably nothing, but I thought you should be aware." Lucas furrowed his brow. "What kind of movement?" "Transfer requests, document access logs, some unusual traffic in your shared portfolio data." Lucas's grip on the phone tightened. "Who accessed it?" There was a brief pause. "Well, Celeste." Lucas felt his heart thud once in his chest. "How?" "She still has joint authorization on certain assets," the advisor replied. "Technically, nothing illegal, just unusual." Lucas ended the call and stood still, the silence in the room growing louder around him. So she had already started. Whatever her plan was, it was already in motion, and he had been too busy indulging himself to notice. He stormed into his office, logged into his accounts, and started scrolling through the activity logs. What he found wasn't overt sabotage, but it was methodical, quiet, strategic. Celeste wasn't making loud moves. She was adjusting positions, shifting permissions, flagging clauses that he had long forgotten existed. She was tightening her grip on the very structure he thought was his alone. That night, while Jasmine was in the bathroom, Lucas sat alone on the balcony, the cold air biting at his skin. He stared at the stars above, wondering when exactly things had started to slip through his fingers. He had always believed he was too powerful to be blindsided. But now, each detail felt like a warning bell he had ignored for too long. Every time Celeste had asked him about a contract, every time she questioned a deal, every time she had stayed quiet when he dismissed her, those were the moments he should have paid attention to. She had learned everything by watching him, and now she was using it. When Jasmine joined him on the balcony, she wrapped a blanket around herself and stood silently beside him. After a long pause, she asked, "Do you still love her?" Lucas didn't answer right away. "It's complicated," he said eventually. Jasmine looked at him. "That's not a no." He turned toward her, searching for the right words, but none came. She stared at him for a moment longer before walking back inside, leaving him alone once again. The next morning, another call came, this time from one of his secondary investors. The tone was colder. There were whispers that his leadership was being questioned, that certain investors were reconsidering their commitments, that someone had been quietly presenting alternative proposals. Lucas tried to maintain his composure, tried to reassure them, but the cracks were widening. It wasn't just about Celeste anymore. It was about his entire empire starting to shift beneath him. By the end of the day, he was pacing his office, trying to come up with a counter-strategy, trying to get ahead of a game he no longer controlled. Jasmine entered, holding a tablet, her expression unreadable. "There's something you should see," she said. He looked at the screen she handed him, and what he saw made his stomach drop. It was a digital prospectus, an investment blueprint with polished branding, detailed market positioning, and an executive summary signed by Celeste Langston. His name was nowhere on it. He read through the document with growing dread. It wasn't just impressive, it was superior, targeted, sustainable, backed by solid projections. The kind of proposal that would attract the exact investors he was beginning to lose. She wasn't just retaliating, she was replacing him. He sat down, the weight of the revelation crushing his breath. Jasmine stood in silence, watching him unravel piece by piece. "She's not trying to destroy you," she said quietly. "She's making you irrelevant." Lucas leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just about an affair or a failing marriage. It was about power, about respect, about who truly held the reins all along. And it wasn't him. The days that followed moved slowly inside the walls of the mansion, though the snow outside continued to fall as if nothing had changed. The world beyond the estate remained untouched, still and pure, while inside, the temperature was beginning to drop in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. Lucas had tried to maintain normalcy, morning routines, business calls, late-night wine by the fire, but something beneath the surface had shifted, and he felt it everywhere. In the way Jasmine moved around the house now, quieter, more calculating. In the way he lingered longer over every notification on his phone, half expecting more news of Celeste's growing influence. In the way his mind returned, over and over again, to that digital prospectus that bore her name and not his. The same woman he once thought of as simply his elegant wife had somehow become a silent threat, an invisible storm gathering strength with each passing hour. Jasmine sensed the shift too. She didn't speak of it directly, but she no longer carried herself with the same carefree energy she once did. The subtle teasing was gone, replaced by long silences and sharp glances. She had always known how to navigate tension, how to manipulate a moment to her favor, but this felt different. It wasn't just about Lucas anymore. It was about the fact that she was no longer sure where she stood. The more she tried to insert herself into conversations, the more she felt him drift away, as if his body was still in the room, but his mind had already left. He had become preoccupied, distant, and worse, unsettled. And if there was one thing Jasmine couldn't stand, it was being part of a situation where her power was slipping through her fingers without her knowing why. She started paying closer attention to his phone calls, to the tone of his voice when he spoke to his advisors, to the names he mentioned, the pauses between his words. It didn't take her long to realize that Celeste's presence had done far more than disrupt a romantic retreat. It had shaken the very foundation of Lucas's empire. He tried to keep the business talk away from her, but she was no fool. She saw the way he checked his email obsessively, how he snapped at the smallest inconveniences, how he spent more time staring into space than engaging with her. The cracks in their affair were growing wider, and Jasmine couldn't help but wonder if they had always been there. She just hadn't looked closely enough before. One evening, she found him sitting in the study, the fireplace glowing behind him, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table. His laptop was open, the screen displaying a spreadsheet filled with red numbers and highlighted notes. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him, waiting for him to acknowledge her presence. When he didn't, she stepped inside. "You're losing control," she said softly, not accusingly, but as a matter of fact. Lucas didn't look up. "I'm handling it." "No, you're reacting to it," she replied. "That's not the same thing." He finally met her gaze, and for a moment, there was a flash of something. Anger, frustration, maybe fear. "Do you have a point, Jasmine?" "Yes," she said, walking closer. "Your wife isn't just angry. She's strategic. You thought this was about emotions. It's not. It's about leverage." He leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. "And what do you suggest I do?" "Stop pretending she's playing the same game you are," she said. "She's not trying to win you back. She's trying to make you obsolete." Lucas stood abruptly, pacing the room. "I know what she's doing. I just didn't expect her to move so fast." "You didn't expect her to move at all," Jasmine countered. "You underestimated her." He didn't respond. He couldn't argue. The truth was undeniable now. His empire was no longer solid ground. Celeste had found the weak points and was pressing into them one by one, not with noise or chaos, but with quiet precision. And that terrified him more than anything else. The next day brought more complications. One of his investors pulled out unexpectedly, citing concerns over recent volatility and rumors of internal instability. Lucas tried to manage the damage, but word was spreading. Something about his leadership was being questioned. Someone was whispering doubts into the ears of people who once trusted him without hesitation. He knew where those whispers were coming from, even if no one said her name out loud. That evening, he received a call from a longtime business associate. The man's voice was polite, almost apologetic, but the message was clear. "I've been approached with a new proposal," he said. "It's compelling, very forward-thinking. You should know that some of your board members have already expressed interest." Lucas felt his throat tighten. "And who's behind this proposal?" There was a pause on the line. "I assumed you already knew." "Celeste Langston." The words hit like a blow, not just because she had moved into his territory, but because she had done it without him noticing. She had turned allies into prospects, friends into competitors, all while he was distracted playing house with a woman who now felt more like a shadow than a partner. After the call, he sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the window. His image was distorted by the falling snow outside, and for a moment, he didn't recognize the man looking back at him. He had spent so much time believing he was untouchable, so much energy convincing himself that his power was absolute. But now he saw the truth. Power was never about how loudly you spoke or how many people followed you. It was about what you controlled in silence. And Celeste had learned that lesson better than anyone. Jasmine entered the room again, watching him from a distance. "What now?" she asked. Lucas turned to her slowly. "Now I fight back." "With what?" she asked, folding her arms. "Panic? Desperation? She's not playing with emotion, Lucas. She's using knowledge. Strategy. You can't beat her by throwing punches in the dark." He looked at her, realizing she was right. He needed a plan, not a reaction. He needed to understand her next move before it happened. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he could. That night, Jasmine found herself alone in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she had ended up in the middle of a war she hadn't prepared for. She had come here expecting luxury, promises, maybe even a place in Lucas's future. But now she saw the truth. She was a spectator in someone else's game, a temporary comfort in a story that was being rewritten without her consent. She didn't know if she had a role anymore, or if she ever really did. Lucas stood in his office again, staring at the digital proposal Celeste had authored, trying to decipher the deeper layers behind each sentence. It wasn't just a business move. It was a message. She wasn't trying to compete with him. She was showing him she no longer needed him. And as the hours passed and the snow continued to fall, Lucas began to understand something he had never truly believed before. Celeste wasn't just taking control of the business. She was taking control of her story, and he was no longer the main character. The snowfall had thickened overnight, blanketing the winding roads that led to the secluded mansion in an untouched sheet of white. It was early morning, and silence dominated the space inside and outside the house. The kind of silence that amplifies thoughts, tightens anxiety, and draws out the ticking seconds. Lucas sat in the lounge area, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes were fixed on the fire, though his mind wasn't focused on anything in particular. His body was present, but his thoughts drifted from one scenario to another, none of them comforting. The room around him, filled with the scent of burnt cedar and the lingering perfume of Jasmine's presence, now felt too quiet. Each sound, wood cracking, a gust of wind brushing the windows, the soft creak of furniture, sounded louder than usual, unnatural almost, like the house itself was reacting to the growing tension within its walls. Jasmine walked in slowly, wearing one of his shirts, her bare legs moving across the floor in deliberate, sultry steps, but her expression betrayed her usual confidence. She had been trying, for days, to re-establish her influence over the energy between them, but nothing seemed to work. Lucas remained distracted, disconnected, and increasingly impatient. She noticed the bags under his eyes, the faint tremor in his fingers, the way his phone never left his hand, even when he wasn't actively using it. It was the behavior of a man who no longer controlled the narrative of his own life, and Jasmine was beginning to resent being caught in the mess he had created. She poured herself coffee, sitting across from him without saying a word. Lucas glanced at her briefly, but said nothing. His mind had already started to play a dangerous game. What if Celeste hadn't just shown up to intimidate him? What if she had come to reclaim more than just her dignity? He had spent the night reviewing documents, checking access logs, calling associates to gauge where loyalties stood, and still, the feeling of control continued to slip through his fingers. There was no solid plan forming, only fragments, loose ideas, half-formed counterattacks. He knew he was supposed to be a leader, a visionary, but now he felt like a man chasing his own shadow. Jasmine's voice broke the silence. What if she's still nearby? Lucas turned his head toward her, surprised by the question. What do you mean? He asked. Jasmine shrugged. What if she didn't leave the area? What if she's watching you, waiting for the right moment? Lucas scoffed lightly, though the idea planted itself in his mind. He hadn't considered that. He had assumed she left after the dramatic appearance with her so-called business associate, but maybe Jasmine was right. Maybe Celeste had only just begun. He stood up, agitated, pacing toward the window. His eyes scanned the snow-covered landscape beyond the glass, but there was no movement, only trees swaying gently under the weight of ice and wind. Still, the tension didn't ease. He couldn't explain it, but something was coming, something he couldn't stop. Hours passed with little change. Lucas had tried to immerse himself in his work, but emails remained unanswered, calls went to voicemail, and even Jasmine had retreated to the other wing of the house, claiming she needed space. The only thing louder than the silence was the unease that grew thicker by the minute. And then, just as the sky began to darken with early evening clouds, the doorbell rang. It was a sound that pierced the stillness like a scream in the night. Lucas froze. He turned toward the sound, heart hammering in his chest. It wasn't just surprise, it was dread. He hadn't invited anyone. No deliveries were expected. No staff had been notified, and the road was barely accessible through the snow. He stepped toward the entryway, each step slow, deliberate, cautious. His hand hovered near the security screen, and when he pressed the button, the camera feed came to life. There she was, Celeste, standing in a tailored winter coat, her hair tucked neatly under a soft hat, her face composed and calm. And again, beside her, was Cole Bennett, the same man from before, though this time his posture was even more assertive, more protective. Lucas didn't move. He stared at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing. There were no bags in their hands, no documents visible, no indication of the reason for their visit. But Celeste's eyes, as they looked directly into the camera, said everything. She wasn't here to beg, or argue, or even negotiate. She was here to reclaim. Lucas opened the door slowly, bracing himself for a confrontation he hadn't prepared for. Celeste met his gaze without hesitation. There was no hesitation in her posture, no uncertainty in her voice when she spoke. "We won't stay long," she said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Cole followed behind her, nodding curtly but saying nothing. Lucas moved aside, instinctively stepping back as if pushed by the weight of her presence. Jasmine appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a robe now, her hair loose, confusion evident on her face. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharp. Celeste looked up at her, offered the faintest smile, then turned her attention back to Lucas. "We came to deliver something," she said simply. Lucas's throat tightened. "What are you talking about?" Cole stepped forward now, pulling a sleek leather folder from his coat and handing it over. "These are revised agreements regarding asset shares, trusts, and business interests jointly managed under your marital contract. You'll want to review them with legal counsel." Lucas took the folder, barely able to keep his hands from trembling. "You're joking," he muttered. "No," Celeste said, her tone colder now. "I'm done being your silent partner. I've moved the assets. I've secured new partners. And I've retained majority interest in 3 of your core subsidiaries." Lucas's world spun. He opened the folder, scanning the documents, his eyes darting from page to page. The language was airtight. The authorizations were legitimate. The signatures were real. She had moved faster than he imagined possible. She had struck in silence and now stood before him not as a scorned wife, but as a corporate adversary. He looked at her, eyes wide, voice hoarse. "Why are you doing this?" Celeste took a step closer, her voice steady. "Because I was never the one who broke this family, Lucas. You were. And I was never going to spend the rest of my life cleaning up your messes while you handed your loyalty to someone else." Jasmine spoke again, incredulous. "You think this makes you powerful? You think this changes anything?" Celeste turned toward her, expression unreadable. "I don't think it. I know it." Without another word, she turned back to Lucas. "You built an empire and forgot who helped you build it. You thought silence was weakness. You were wrong." She turned toward the door, Cole following her again. And just before stepping outside, she looked back one last time. "I'm not your wife anymore, Lucas. I'm your competition." And with that, she vanished into the cold night, leaving behind a house that no longer felt like his. The front door clicked shut, and with it, the silence in the mansion deepened into something nearly suffocating. Lucas stood motionless in the center of the foyer, still gripping the leather folder in one hand while his other hung limply by his side. He could feel his pulse in his throat, pounding like a drumbeat beneath his skin. He wanted to believe it was a bluff. He wanted to believe there was some flaw in the documents, some loophole, some technicality that would make it all disappear. But as he flipped through each page again, the cold weight of reality settled deeper in his chest. Celeste had not only found a way to legally restructure their shared holdings, she had done it so seamlessly, so quietly, that by the time he realized what was happening, it was already too late. She had moved beyond emotion, beyond vengeance. This wasn't a desperate act of retaliation. It was a strategic business maneuver executed with surgical precision. Jasmine lingered by the staircase, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She was dressed in the same robe she wore when Celeste arrived, but now, all pretense of confidence had drained from her posture. She looked at Lucas as if seeing him for the first time, as if trying to gauge whether the man she had seduced still held any semblance of power at all. "Are you going to say something?" she asked eventually, her voice quiet but edged with growing frustration. Lucas didn't respond. He simply walked into the study and dropped the folder onto his desk with a loud slap that echoed through the room. He pulled off his blazer and tossed it over the back of a chair before sinking into the leather seat. He stared at the folder as if it might come alive and reverse everything inside it. Jasmine followed, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "She humiliated you," she said, not hiding the bitterness in her voice. "She walked in here like she owns this place." Lucas rubbed his temples, trying to block out her voice. "She does," he muttered, almost to himself. Jasmine stiffened. "What?" "She owns more than you think," he said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "Those assets, those companies, she didn't just reposition them. She leveraged the contracts we signed years ago, the ones I thought didn't matter." Jasmine moved closer. "Then fight her. Hire someone. Counteract it. Do something." "I can't fight what's already signed and sealed," Lucas snapped. "She was smart enough to execute everything through channels I never paid attention to. Everything she did was legal, binding, and strategically flawless. I can't even claim misconduct because the authorizations are all legitimate." Jasmine's frustration boiled over. "So what? You're just going to let her walk all over you? After everything you've built?" Lucas turned to her sharply. "I didn't build it alone," he said. That's the part one forgot. And now I'm paying the price. Jasmine stared at him in disbelief. She had never seen him like this, broken, humbled, reflective. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She had fallen in love with a man who commanded rooms with confidence, who made decisions without hesitation. Now he looked like a man drowning in his own consequences. She wanted to yell, to shake him out of it, to force him back into the role of the invincible leader she had idolized. But deep down, she knew that the shift had already occurred. Celeste hadn't just taken his assets. She had taken his confidence, his control, his identity. Meanwhile, across town, Celeste and Cole sat in a private office high above the city skyline. The room was sleek, modern, and bathed in natural light from floor-to-ceiling windows. It was the headquarters of one of Cole's subsidiary investment firms, a place where only a handful of people had access, and even fewer understood the magnitude of the deals discussed within its walls. Celeste sat across from him at the large glass conference table, a fresh stack of documents spread before her. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were sharp. She had never felt more focused, never felt more alive. She was no longer the silent figure standing behind her husband's empire. She was now the architect of something entirely her own. Cole leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You executed that flawlessly," he said. "I've seen hostile takeovers with less coordination." Celeste smiled faintly. "It wasn't hostile. It was overdue." He nodded, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "Lucas won't go down quietly. You know that." "I'm not asking him to go down," she replied. "I'm just showing him he's no longer the only one capable of building something great." Cole watched her for a moment longer before sliding another document across the table. "There's interest from 2 other investment groups. They've heard about your proposal and want to explore joint ventures. If you agree to the preliminary terms, we can start negotiations next week." Celeste took the paper, scanning the details. Every move she made now had to be deliberate. Every step had to be calculated. She wasn't just protecting herself anymore. She was building a future for her child, a legacy that wouldn't be overshadowed by the name Langston. "Let's proceed," she said firmly. Cole smiled. "I knew you'd say that." Back at the mansion, Lucas paced his office, unable to focus. The folder sat open on the desk, its contents staring back at him like a reminder of his arrogance. He picked up his phone and dialed one of his attorneys, hoping to find a loophole, a technical error, anything he could exploit. The conversation was short and disappointing. The legal groundwork was airtight. Celeste had covered every angle. He ended the call and slumped into his chair again, burying his face in his hands. His empire was slipping, not because someone attacked it, but because someone understood it better than he did. Later that evening, he received an email from a mutual contact, a former investor who had just committed to Celeste's new venture. The subject line was simple: a better future. The message inside was worse, a glowing endorsement of her vision, a subtle acknowledgement that her strategy was not only solid but inspiring. Lucas closed the laptop, his pulse racing. The damage was growing. The investors who once hung on his every word were now turning to the woman he had dismissed as irrelevant. Jasmine entered the room quietly, sensing the tension again. "What now?" she asked. Lucas looked at her, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched. "Now I find out who I am without her." Jasmine narrowed her eyes. "And who is that, Lucas?" He didn't answer, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. The mansion no longer felt like a sanctuary. The walls that once echoed with laughter and whispered promises now resonated with tension and fractured silence. Lucas wandered through the grand hallways like a ghost of his former self, every corner reminding him of the empire he had once commanded with certainty. The paintings that lined the corridors, the polished marble floors, the chandelier that sparkled above the spiral staircase. None of it offered comfort anymore. All of it felt like a monument to his arrogance, a reminder that power without awareness is nothing more than a ticking clock toward collapse. And the ticking had grown louder, faster, more insistent. The illusion he had crafted so carefully was cracking, piece by piece, and he could feel the weight of its collapse in every breath he took. Jasmine had stopped asking questions. She moved through the house with the demeanor of someone who knew the end of a story but refused to say it out loud. She no longer sought his attention, no longer tried to provoke him into intimacy or conversation. She had shifted into self-preservation mode, calculating her next move in silence. The woman who once curled around him like silk now seemed wrapped in her own armor, distant, restrained, unreadable. She was beginning to understand something she should have seen sooner. Lucas was not a man building a future. He was a man clinging to the ruins of a past he no longer controlled. She watched him spiral, and though part of her still wanted to pull him back, a stronger part of her wanted to walk away before she got buried beneath the rubble with him. On the third morning after Celeste's visit, Lucas received a notification that sent a cold shiver down his spine. A joint venture deal he had been preparing for over a year had been officially withdrawn. The investor, once a close friend and staunch supporter, cited strategic redirection as the reason. But Lucas knew better. Behind those polite words was the hand of Celeste. He sat at his desk for nearly an hour, staring at the email, unable to move. His empire was unraveling not because of scandal or sabotage, but because of quiet, calculated redirection. Celeste wasn't destroying him out of vengeance. She was replacing him out of competence. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to broadcast her moves. She was winning because she understood the game better than he did, and worse, because she had been playing it from the shadows for far longer than he realized. He called an emergency meeting with his core advisory board. Half of them declined to attend, citing scheduling conflicts. The other half joined the video conference with stiff politeness and forced smiles. As Lucas tried to reassure them, laying out a new strategy, offering revised projections, promising aggressive growth in the next quarter, he could see it in their eyes. They weren't listening. They were already somewhere else, already aligning themselves with a future that no longer had him at the center. One by one, they nodded along, but no one asked questions, no one offered input, no one showed interest. It was the corporate equivalent of a funeral, and Lucas was the only one unaware that he was the one being buried. After the call, Lucas remained seated in the conference room, staring at his reflection in the glossy surface of the table. He looked older than he remembered, more fragile. The man who once commanded attention with just a glance now looked like a man chasing his own shadow. Jasmine walked in quietly, holding a glass of whiskey. She placed it in front of him without a word and sat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she finally broke the silence. "It's over, isn't it?" Lucas didn't answer immediately. He picked up the glass, studied the liquid for a moment, then drank it in one gulp. He set it down slowly and looked at her. "Not yet," he said. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "What's left to save?" "Me," he replied softly. "I have to find a way to survive this." Jasmine shook her head. "You can't rebuild what's already been taken. You don't just need to survive. You need to understand who you were when you let it fall apart." Her words stung more than he expected. He stood up and walked toward the window, staring out at the white expanse of snow that now looked more like a burial ground than a retreat. He thought about the early days of his career, the hunger, the fire, the sleepless nights spent chasing deals and building trust. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped chasing purpose and started chasing image. He built a life that looked perfect from the outside, but had hollowed out from within. He traded loyalty for excitement, substance for spectacle, and now he was standing in the ruins of his own creation. The following evening, another blow landed. A news article began circulating through industry channels, subtly praising a new business initiative led by Celeste Langston and Cole Bennett. The tone was admiring, the language carefully chosen, but the message was clear. A new power player had entered the arena, and it wasn't Lucas. His name wasn't even mentioned in the article, not as a competitor, not as a former partner, not even as a footnote. He had been erased, not with malice, but with irrelevance. That hurt more than anything else. To be forgotten by a world he once dominated. He printed the article and stared at it for hours, rereading every line, memorizing every subtle implication. He imagined the look on Celeste's face when she read it, imagined her satisfaction, her quiet pride. He wondered if she had smiled, if she had felt vindicated. And then he wondered something that pierced deeper than anything else. Did she feel free? Later that night, Lucas wandered through the mansion alone. He entered the guest room Jasmine had been using, looked at the open suitcase on the bed, the scattered clothes, the abandoned makeup bag on the counter. He walked into the closet and saw that some of her clothes were already gone. She hadn't said it yet, but he knew. She was preparing to leave. She wasn't going to wait for him to collapse completely. She was going to save herself before the walls came down. And he couldn't blame her. He walked through the house until he found himself in the master bedroom, the one he used to share with Celeste. It looked untouched, almost sacred, like a museum exhibit frozen in time. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the vanity, the faint imprint of where her perfume bottles once stood, the drawer where she kept her journals, the mirror that once reflected a life he thought was permanent. He imagined her there, brushing her hair, smiling gently, unaware of how temporary everything had become. Or maybe she knew all along and had simply chosen silence over confrontation. As the clock ticked into the early hours of the morning, Lucas remained in that room, alone with memories and consequences. He had spent years believing that success was measured by dominance, by control, by the ability to dictate outcomes. But now he understood that real power wasn't loud or visible. Real power moved quietly, patiently, and struck without warning. Celeste had become more powerful not in spite of her silence, but because of it. And in the end, she hadn't needed to destroy him. She only needed to leave him behind. The cold had settled into the mansion like a second skin, creeping through the cracks in the windows, pressing against the glass walls, and settling in the corners where light no longer reached. Lucas sat alone in the library, the amber glow of the lamp casting long shadows around him as his fingers traced the edges of a worn book he hadn't read in years. He wasn't reading it now either. He was simply holding it, clinging to something familiar while the unfamiliar reality of his unraveling life swallowed everything else. There was a stillness in the air that night, but it wasn't peace, it was resignation. A kind of quiet that comes after a storm, not because the storm has passed, but because there's nothing left to destroy. He stared at the fireplace without really seeing it, his thoughts circling the same questions over and over again. Questions that had no answers, questions he should have asked long ago when there was still time to change things. But time had moved without him, and now all that remained was the echo of choices he couldn't undo. He reached into the side drawer of the bookshelf and pulled out a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were photos, letters, little fragments of a life he had once shared with Celeste. A plane ticket from their first vacation, a receipt from the diner where he proposed, a handwritten note she had left on his desk on the morning of their 5th anniversary. He held that note now, unfolding it slowly, eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was simple, barely a few lines, but it hit harder than any confrontation ever could. In all the noise, I hope you still hear me. In all the light, I hope you still see me. And when you forget everything else, I hope you remember how we started. He didn't remember reading it back then. He had likely skimmed it in a rush, kissed her forehead absent-mindedly, and left for a meeting that felt more urgent than a quiet moment with his wife. He read the note again now, and again, and again, each time feeling the weight of everything he had taken for granted pressing harder against his chest. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, letting the silence settle again. He tried to remember the last time he had truly looked at her, not just seen her face, but really looked into her, into the woman who had stood by him when no one else believed in his vision, the woman who had held his secrets, managed his crises, softened his hard edges, and gave him a name that meant something beyond contracts and numbers. He remembered their long nights in the early days, building their business from a cramped apartment, eating takeout while reviewing spreadsheets, celebrating small wins with cheap wine and big dreams. He remembered how she used to fall asleep on the couch with his laptop still open on her lap, how she used to leave notes in his planner when he was overwhelmed, how she used to hold his hand under the table during tense meetings just to remind him he wasn't alone. He remembered it all now, and it burned more than he thought possible. And still, she had never shouted, never thrown accusations, never demanded explanations. She had only watched, listened, and quietly started to remove herself from the equation. She hadn't stormed out of his life. She had simply walked away with dignity, and now, even in her absence, she continued to speak louder than anyone else in his world. He stood up slowly and walked through the hall toward the master bedroom, a space he had avoided for days. He opened the door and stepped inside. The scent of her perfume still lingered faintly in the air, delicate and haunting. On the dresser, a new envelope had been placed since the last time he was there. He hadn't noticed it before. He walked over and picked it up, recognizing her handwriting immediately. His fingers hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a letter, longer than any she had written him in years. He sat down on the edge of the bed and began to read, each word piercing him deeper than the last. "Lucas, I never intended to compete with you. I never wanted to fight for power in a world we were supposed to build together. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that I was part of this, that I mattered beyond what I could do for you. I stood by you when we had nothing. I defended you when others mocked your vision. I protected your reputation even when it cost me my peace. But you traded all of that for illusions. You chased youth, novelty, attention. You forgot that strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it watches, sometimes it waits. And when it decides to walk away, it doesn't come back." His eyes blurred as he read further. "You made me invisible in the home I helped build. You replaced my voice with your silence, my presence with your distractions. And still, I stayed longer than I should have. Not because I was weak, but because I believed in what we once were. I waited for you to remember, but I won't wait anymore. I've taken what I deserve, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. This isn't a war, Lucas. It's a farewell." He folded the letter slowly, resting it in his lap, his hands trembling. The pain was sharp, not just because of what she had written, but because every word was true. He had lost her long before she walked away. He just hadn't seen it. He had been blind to the quiet unraveling, deaf to the silence that screamed louder than any accusation. And now, he was left with echoes. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. He walked to the window and looked out, watching the white cover stretch across the landscape like a clean slate, a final erasure of the path he had chosen. Behind him, the house remained still, filled with memories that no longer belonged to anyone. He thought of calling her, of trying to explain, to apologize, to ask for one more chance. But he knew it was useless. This wasn't a moment for repair. It was a moment of recognition. He had broken something he couldn't fix, and in her silence, she had delivered the truth he refused to face. And that truth would follow him for the rest of his life. The days moved slowly now, each one blending into the next with an eerie sameness that wrapped the mansion in a suffocating stillness. Lucas moved through the halls like a man suspended in time, drifting from one room to another, unable to find purpose in any of them. The phone calls had nearly stopped altogether. Once his phone had rung constantly with deals, meetings, invitations, and congratulatory messages. Now it sat on the edge of his desk like a relic of a former life, vibrating occasionally with meaningless notifications, automated messages from banks, irrelevant updates from apps he no longer cared to open, the occasional shallow attempt from acquaintances who hadn't yet realized he had already disappeared from the inner circle. The empire he had built so carefully was not crumbling in one grand explosion. It was eroding quietly, piece by piece, like sand slipping between his fingers while he watched, helpless to stop it. Jasmine's departure was neither dramatic nor emotional. One morning, Lucas woke up to find her side of the bed empty. Her suitcase was gone. The closet space where her clothes once hung was vacant. The faint scent of her perfume had vanished from the air. On the kitchen counter, there was a note, written hastily and with no signature. "You need to figure out who you are without using people to define you. I won't wait around while you fall apart." That was all. No accusations, no farewells, no final plea for him to fight for her. Just a quiet resignation, the final thread in a story that had unraveled long before either of them had the courage to admit it. He had expected it, in some distant part of his mind. Still, the confirmation of her absence brought a strange hollowness he hadn't prepared for. He wasn't devastated. He wasn't angry. He was just empty. In the following weeks, more dominoes fell. One of his core companies was acquired through a hostile buyout facilitated by a firm that had recently aligned with Celeste's new investment group. The transaction had been legal, clean, and irreversible. His attempts to block the acquisition had failed before they even began. The boardroom where he once held court was no longer his. The executives he had mentored, groomed, and entrusted were now reshaping their allegiance. New leadership had been appointed. New direction announced. His name was quietly removed from the company's founding credits. No public humiliation, no headlines splashed across news sites. Just a subtle replacement, an erasure carried out with the efficiency of a surgical procedure. He was no longer an asset. He was a liability they were eager to forget. Lucas stood outside the office building that had once been the headquarters of his empire. The signage had already been changed, the lobby redesigned, the branding replaced. The receptionist didn't even recognize him when he entered. She greeted him politely, asked for an appointment, then informed him that walk-ins weren't allowed. He didn't argue. He turned around and walked out, stepping into the bitter wind without saying another word. That night, he sat on the balcony of the mansion, staring into the dark tree line below. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the damp earth underneath. The landscape looked different now, raw, exposed, stripped of its pristine cover. Much like him, he thought of calling Celeste, just to hear her voice, to say something. Anything that might feel like closure. But he didn't. What would he say? That he was sorry? That he hadn't known what he was losing? That he missed her? None of it would matter now. She had given him every opportunity to change course. She had warned him without words, offered chances without ultimatums. And he had wasted them all. He poured himself a drink and sat in silence. His mind drifted to old conversations, small moments he had once dismissed, now replaying with painful clarity. He remembered how she used to pause after asking him questions, giving him time to respond, even when he didn't. He remembered how she used to watch him during meetings, catching the nuances he missed, offering insights that he had claimed as his own. He remembered how she handled delicate negotiations with grace while he soaked up the praise. He remembered how he had silenced her presence by thinking he was speaking louder. And now he realized that all along, she had been the foundation he stood on. And when she walked away, the ground beneath him collapsed. One evening, a former rival invited him to dinner. A man who had once envied Lucas's position, who had tried for years to outmaneuver him. The invitation was formal, polite, but beneath the words, Lucas recognized the tone. It wasn't camaraderie. It was victory. He declined the invitation and turned off his phone for the rest of the night. He didn't want to see the world he used to rule from the outside. He didn't want to be a guest at tables where he once sat at the head. He didn't want to be pitted. Because that was the worst part. Not the loss of status or assets, but the realization that people were beginning to feel sorry for him. He stopped answering calls altogether. He shut down social media accounts, canceled subscriptions, removed himself from public mailing lists. He disconnected not to find peace, but because the noise reminded him too much of what he had lost. The quiet didn't bring healing. It brought clarity, and the clarity was cruel. He realized he had never truly appreciated the empire he built. Not the people who supported it, not the woman who helped create it, not the values that once guided him. He had chased bigger deals, more extravagant wins, louder applause, thinking that success was about accumulation. But now, stripped of all excess, he saw the truth. Success meant nothing if it came at the cost of substance. He remembered a conversation he once had with Celeste in their early years. He had told her, half-jokingly, that he wanted to build a legacy no one could erase. She had smiled at him then and said, "Legacies aren't built with money. They're built with meaning." He had laughed at the time, dismissing it as one of her poetic ideals. But now, those words echoed louder than ever. One morning, as he walked through the garden behind the mansion, he found a letter tucked into the mailbox. There was no return address. The envelope was blank. He opened it cautiously, unsure what to expect. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed and signed. But the message was unmistakably hers. "When silence becomes louder than words, remember that you taught me how to use it." He stood there for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands, his breath caught in his throat. He knew then that Celeste hadn't just left him. She had transcended him. She had become a force beyond his reach, beyond his understanding. And all he could do now was live with the echo of a woman he once had but never truly saw. The city was waking up beneath a soft drizzle, the streets still glistening from the rain that had fallen through the night. The sky carried that familiar tone of pale gray, stretching endlessly above the skyline, reflecting off the tall buildings and the smooth surfaces of black sedans crawling through traffic. Inside a quiet, modern apartment perched high above the city, Celeste stood at the window, cradling her newborn in her arms. The baby was wrapped in a delicate cream-colored blanket, his tiny fingers curling gently against her skin. The morning light filtered softly through the sheer curtains, casting a calm glow across the room. There was peace in this space, a kind of stillness that came not from silence, but from clarity. A different kind of power pulsed through the air now, a gentle, grounded strength, the kind that doesn't shout but anchors everything around it. This was not just a new chapter. It was an entirely different story. The apartment was elegant but not extravagant. Clean lines, warm wood, and soft textures made it feel like a home rather than a statement. It didn't resemble the cold grandeur of the mansion she had left behind. It didn't carry the weight of marble or the echo of empty rooms designed to impress rather than comfort. Here, everything had been chosen with purpose. The books on the shelves, the photographs on the walls, the handmade crib nestled in the corner. They were reflections of who she had become. No longer defined by a title, no longer hidden behind another's name. She had rewritten her identity in every detail of this space. And it wasn't just for her. It was for the little life she now held close to her heart. A new life. A clean beginning. Cole walked in from the kitchen, carrying 2 mugs of tea, setting one beside her before sitting on the nearby couch. He didn't speak at first. He knew these early mornings were sacred to her. He simply sat, watching the soft expression on her face as she looked down at her son. The baby shifted slightly, his mouth parting as he settled into sleep again. Celeste ran her finger gently over his cheek and then turned her gaze toward Cole, offering a quiet smile. "He's perfect," she whispered. Cole nodded. "He is. Just like his mother." There was a moment of stillness, a soft pause in time. Celeste looked out the window again, watching the city move, watching the world continue without hesitation. So much had changed, and yet everything outside looked the same. But within her, there was no doubt. Everything was different. She had stepped out of a life that once defined her and into a future she had shaped with her own hands. She didn't need headlines or grand announcements to feel powerful. Her strength came from knowing she had rebuilt herself from the ruins, piece by piece, without ever compromising her soul. She had watched Lucas fall not because she pushed him, but because he stood on foundations built of ego and illusion. He had confused silence with weakness, and now he lived surrounded by echoes of what he once had. She had given him years of her life, loyalty without condition, support without praise. And when he chose to trade that for fleeting satisfaction, she didn't fight him. She simply stepped aside and let the weight of his choices take him down. That was her greatest act of defiance, choosing peace when he expected chaos, building when he expected her to break. Cole sipped his tea, glancing toward the baby. "Have you thought of a name yet?" Celeste smiled thoughtfully, running her hand over the baby's head. "I've been thinking," she said. "I want his name to mean something. I want him to grow up knowing he came from strength, from choice, from a mother who never let herself be defined by someone else's shadow." Cole nodded, understanding her without needing her to explain further. That had always been one of his greatest qualities, his ability to hear what wasn't spoken. As the morning stretched on, Celeste moved through her day with a quiet rhythm. Feeding, bathing, resting, managing work calls with her team, reviewing partnership proposals, and overseeing the final stages of a new investment fund designed to support women-led ventures. Her schedule was full, but not chaotic. It was purposeful, intentional, balanced. She no longer had to beg for space in meetings, no longer had to explain herself in rooms where she once had to prove she belonged. Now, people leaned in when she spoke. Now, decisions carried her signature. Now, she was no longer just a presence in someone else's empire. She was the architect of her own. And while Lucas struggled in the silence of his empty estate, chasing ghosts of former power, Celeste lived in a space filled with movement, life, and renewal. She didn't waste time wondering if he missed her, or if he regretted what he had done. She had already received her closure, not in words or apologies, but in the simple act of reclaiming her life and watching herself thrive without him. That was the truest form of vindication, not revenge, not confrontation, but transcendence. Rising above what was meant to diminish her, becoming more than anyone expected, especially him. That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and the city lights began to flicker to life, Celeste stood once more by the window, her son resting quietly in her arms. She whispered to him, her voice soft and steady. "You came into this world in the middle of chaos, but you will grow in peace. You will grow watching strength, not arrogance. You will grow knowing love that doesn't have to be loud to be true. And you will never have to question what a woman is capable of." Behind her, Cole watched silently, his presence calm and unintrusive. He knew this wasn't his moment. It was hers. And perhaps in time, something deeper would grow between them. But for now, he was exactly what she needed: steadfast, respectful, present. As the city pulsed below and the stars began to peek through the haze above, Celeste smiled to herself. Not because she had won, but because she had endured. Not because she had conquered, but because she had chosen herself. And in that choice, she had rewritten everything.